Welcome back to episode 10 today of the Broadrun podcast. I hope you're all doing well and your running is going well and you've enjoyed the first 9 episodes of the podcast. Obviously, most of them have just been short form conversations, just over different things that my running clients have been asking me and just different things that I want to talk about in a bit of a video form. So I hope you're enjoying it. Today we're going to be talking about running zones, something you probably heard about on my last podcast where I was talking about the Maffetone method, which is using predominantly zone 2 training and definitely like sub-threshold training to sort of improve your fitness and sort of maximizing sort of time in aerobic zones. So I just want to sort of go through talk about sort of understanding each of the different zones, how you can sort of plan them, and sort of what you're sort of looking for in the different zones, and then also explain how to measure them and how to incorporate them into your routine. So basically, zones just sort of are like a scientific way to define the different intensities in which you run. So in running, we typically go off 5 zones. There are, if you go into other endurance training, cycling often uses like up to 7 zones. But for running, we stick with 5 basic zones. So each different zones targeting different energy systems. Hopefully I can touch on a bit about each energy system and what that means. I don't want to overcomplicate it too much. I'd like to go into that maybe a bit more detail another time. So starting at the very bottom, you're talking about zone 1, which will be like very easy pace. So this will be like between sort of anywhere between like 50 and 60% of your maximum heart rate. So this is, really, really easy pace, and you should be able to sort of look at holding, like I always say to my running clients, like holding a comfortable conversation with it. So if I was running with you, you'd be able to tell me probably about, I always use this as in the talk test. I'll say like, my name is Blair, I come from Scotland, and I'm out today on a run. So that's my sentence that I think about when I'm running. So I should be able to say that full sentence without, having to take a big deep breath. So that's sort of what I'm sort of aiming at when I'm going into zone 1. So we use this for sort of active recovery workouts, and we also use this for maybe just like really easy mileage. If we're maybe in the basics of like a marathon plan and we're looking just to get the distance up, we might do some runs around this zone 1. So if you're obviously I don't want to give specifics of heart rates because everyone's different, but if you're able to go and take your smartwatch of choice, or you can even go into heart rate zone calculator on Google and then put in your maximum heart rate, it will give you what your easy zone heart rate in there. So in this area that we're using is predominantly like fat burning that we're using for our energy usage for the run. So it's nice and easy. We're not starting to burn into those like high carbohydrate levels as we go on. So that's sort of basics of zone 1. So this is where you should probably accumulate a lot of your time in here and also in zone 2. So zone 2, also known as like your aerobic base zone. So this is before the first inflection on the lactate curve. So this will be sort of steady aerobic pace, still with your maximum heart rate between sort of 60 and 70% around there. So obviously you are probably breathing a little bit. If you're thinking about your sentence that you're going to say like, my name is Blair, breath, I come from Scotland and I'm out on a run. So a breath between each of the three sentences. You'll probably notice they're not really pushing it too hard, but this is obviously where you're probably going to accumulate the most mileage between here and your zone 1, but here mostly. This is pretty much where you get your most aerobic benefits. Zone 3, this is like between sort of LT1, your lactate threshold point 1, and lactate threshold point 2. So this is where you're it's starting to get sustainably hard. So people sort of refer to this as like your tempo. So you'll, depending on your fitness levels, you'll be able to sort of maintain this pace for anywhere between sort of 20 minutes and an hour, depending, people who are a lot fitter. This is actually something that determines the sort of the fitness of the top elite marathoners, which will be sort of the bigger that their zone 3 is, because in order to run a successful marathon, they have to have a very high second lactate threshold, so before they get into zone 4. So this is, something that we'll use, especially in sort of marathon training, working in this zone, also known as like high aerobic zone sometimes. But if you're thinking about your talk test, so this will be around 70 to 80% of your max heart rate. So if you're thinking about your talk test, you're probably going to be able to say, 2 or 3 words of your total like sentence, like my name is Blair and I'm from Scotland, breath, and I'm out on a run, breath, you're going to just breathe just that bit faster. You'll slowly start to feel when you're running this zone that, you'll start to find that lactate accumulation. It's not sudden. It's not something that it'll come on gradually. So that's what I mean. Normally, it, depending on your fitness levels, obviously will determine to what point that you sort of reach that saturation of the lactate in your system, which will effectively sort of end the end of that zone, where you start to see rapid rise of lactate levels that your body's no longer able to sort of deal with as in use for running. And then you'll sort of start to go into that. So zone 4 is around 80 to 90% of your max heart rate. So this is like a really challenging effort where, you're really pushing it. So if you're on the other side of your threshold, this is where you sort of start to see sudden rises in lactate. And this is probably above here is where you start to sort of work in for your 5K, 10K time, something. If you're able to increase your lactate threshold here, where zone 4 begins, this is like one of the biggest determining factors of how fast you'll be able to run. So it's a really challenging zone, and then you're probably talking about one or two word efforts, 1 or 2 words maximum when you're in here. So an example of like a typical threshold session, you would get this zone, work in this zone for anywhere between sort of 4 to 8 minutes, work in around where your threshold is, and sort of try to improve your body's ability in flushing out lactate, and obviously using lactate for energy production. So and then you'll start to go into zone 5. So zone 5 will be determined as like a interval pace or an anaerobic, like all out burst. So this is like heart rate sort of above 90, sort of 95% of your maximum heart rate. So this is what you will use for your things like your VO2 max intervals, where you're sort of doing anywhere between 200 to 800 meter repeats. And I mean, this is a pretty much all-out effort, like I said, so you're probably talking 1 word efforts. Obviously, you're not going to go, because of the way that the sort of heart rate lags and effort sort of lags, these kind of things, like we work to sort of accumulate time in this zone. So if we're going to do, say, 200-300 meter repeats, our heart rate will not probably immediately reflect into this zone, but you can check out like workouts of what people do, and you'll see them that sort of slowly working. If you're going to do like 800 meters and you're doing 6 of them, you'll see them slowly building their heart rate into this sort of zone towards the end. And by the end of it, you're really pushing, and you probably end up seeing yourself in that zone for, like anywhere between like 2 and 6 minutes. Like everything, something that's sort of is talked about quite a lot. Where the body doesn't just switch from one sort of energy system to another immediately. Like it's a bit more nuanced than that. So your body's going to be using still like aerobic parts of the system. But it's going to be predominantly aerobic. But the changeover isn't just sudden. It doesn't just happen automatically. So that does take time. So and then you're obviously only going to spend time in this zone. I'm talking minutes per week. You're single figure digits a week, and it is an all out effort. So if you were going to sort of break down the amount of time in a week that you would spend in the different zones, you would be spending probably 80% of the time or 70% of the time in zone 1, zone 2. Maybe spend 10-15% in this like zones sort of 3 and 4, and then you're probably spending 5% or less in zone 5. And again, this is obviously scalable depending on your sort of ability. Maybe you're able to get more sessions in a week, but that just depends on what level you're at. And yeah, I've just tried to keep it really simple in this description. Like, I don't want to go in too deep with different things, to just overcomplicate it. But if you sort of think about what I just said and the amount of time in the week that you're spending, that's a good way to sort of base your training. So, I always think it is like important, especially when you're 1 and 2. Like, I wouldn't think too much about going out and constantly looking at your watch to think, like, for me, is my heart rate below 145? Is it, am I doing this? I'm doing that. I just sort of make sure that you sort of understand the conversation, the talk test, and start to sort of think about like on the RPE scale of like 1 to 10. So if you're thinking about zone 2, it's probably everything up to sort of 0 to like anywhere from 3 to 6. Tempo is probably starting to get into 7. Threshold would be an 8, and zone 5 would be a 9 or 10. And I'm talking 10 is like you cannot give any more. So try to listen to your body. I think that's the main thing. And if you're trying to rack up miles and you're sort of thinking this is supposed to be easy, but it isn't, but my heart rate, you hear all sorts of excuses, and not excuses, but people who don't really know. And then they come out and say like, oh, I'm trying to do my mileage in zone 2. You look at their heart rates and you see it's like 160, 170, probably closer to their tempo effort. And they say, oh, I wasn't able to finish my long run because, because of this and that. My heart rate's naturally high. Most of the time it's just an excuse. You are where you are. And it's important to stick to what zones you are in. And if you start training specifically in the zones that are appropriate to you, you will start seeing greater benefits. And I think everybody, including myself, has probably went through this as a runner. And you might even be listening to this and think, that'll never be me. I know what I'm talking about, but it does happen. So, it is good to sort of listen to your body and sort of go off that. But I thought I would just basically run across that. So anybody who has got sort of any questions about the different zones and how they're feeling, I hope I've covered the sort of basics of that correctly. And if you've got any sort of points about your training, what you found worked, what you found better, different types of workouts for the different zones, I think I'll maybe go into that in a different episode where I just talk about different sessions which will sort of help those different zones. Okay, so thanks very much for listening, and I'll see you next time.